People's behavior can be shocking sometimes. Would you believe that a lot of conference speakers give their talks while they're high? I'm high right now. 4,200 feet. So I figured, since I'm high and you're high, this would be a good chance for us to talk about legacy code. Before I get into this stuff, I want to get a quick show of hands. How many people here have ever worked on a legacy project? Okay. Who hasn't? I did this at one conference, and like half the room didn't raise their hands. And I was like, you guys are lying. Who's working on a legacy project now? And who is maybe not quite as happy as they could be with their level of test coverage on the legacy project? Okay. That's good that a lot of people raise their hands, because that means what I am about to say might be useful. So we're going to talk about the challenges of working on a legacy project, the ways tests can mitigate those challenges, and then the obstacles to putting tests on a legacy project, because unfortunately, it's not just as simple as making the decision to do it and then doing it. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen. Then I'm going to share techniques that can be used to overcome those obstacles. A little bit about me first. My name is Jason Swett. I'm from Sand Lake, Michigan, which is there. It's the Grand Rapids area, but we live in the woods with 3 cats, 2 dogs, like 15 ducks, and 70 chickens, and 3 goats, and like 5 rabbits. And maybe some other stuff that I don't know about yet. Sometimes I leave and I come back and my wife has gotten more animals. This is my family. This is us in India. Where's Matt's? I don't know if he's here, but okay. Matt's was there too. Not in this picture, but he was in India. We were there for RubyConf India. I also wrote this book called Rails Testing for Beginners, and I host the Ruby Testing podcast. So Rails testing is kind of my thing. Just out of curiosity, I know there's at least 3 of us here, but anybody listen to the Ruby Testing podcast by chance? Yay. Oh yeah, Molly was on it. Yeah. Okay, so characteristics of a legacy project. And I want to get a little bit of audience participation here. Who can tell me some of the characteristics of a legacy project? Rails version is under 4. Okay, so the generalized version of that might be old tools, maybe even outdated, deprecated tools. What else? Adrian. Tightly coupled systems. Okay, I think I saw a hand over here. Lack of test coverage. All right.
The original authors pieced out.
The original authors pieced out. It does happen. I don't even know what that means. No dependency manifest? Okay, well, that must be a characteristic of a legacy project if it's not even there. Okay, you with the beard.
There's a lot of business logic, and some of it may not even be relevant anymore.
Ooh, yeah, so like dead code? Yeah. All right, up there in the glasses. A plugins folder. Very specific and opinionated. Okay. You there. That's a big one. You're afraid to change it because you don't know exactly what it does. In a lot of cases, not only do you not know what it does, you don't even know what it should do. And sometimes what it actually does and what it should do are not exactly the same thing, but even though it does the wrong thing, you need to keep it doing the wrong thing, because if you make it do the right thing, then that becomes wrong. Up there. Lots of different patterns. Okay. So maybe one area of the code base is in one style, another area of the code base is in another style. I'm not going to take too many more of these, but way up there. Might be in a completely different language than what? Oh, yeah. Okay, so it's legacy if it's not Ruby. That's interesting. I'm sure that's not what you meant. Okay, last one. You up there. Ooh, okay. So again, to generalize that would be old code. Okay, one that I don't think anybody said, but it's definitely a characteristic of a legacy project commonly, is bad code. Often the code in a legacy project is really difficult to work with. I think most of us would agree that that's true. Here's my list. First one is bad code. And what I mean when I say bad code, and what I think most people mean when they say bad code, is just code that's hard to understand. Few or no tests. That's a typo. Original maintainers who are no longer available. They've pieced out. One we didn't really mention, poor development processes. The code didn't write itself. It came into existence by some development methodology. Often that development methodology is still happening when you join the project. Unknown proper behavior. And of course, nobody mentioned this either, maybe because it's just such an obvious one, bugs. Legacy projects tend to have bugs, and the bugs that exist make it even easier to introduce new bugs. And you know, it kind of all makes you want to say, oh, shallots! Doesn't it? I know that's what most of you are thinking. You're thinking, shallots. So those are the characteristics of a legacy project. Here are the challenges that translates to. It means changes take a long time. Let's get a show of hands on this. Have you ever been asked to change something in a hairy code base? The person who asked you to make the change maybe expects it to take a couple hours. And maybe you expect it to take a couple hours. Then the next day you have to explain why you're still working on it. Then the day after that, you have to explain that you're still working on it. It might take several days just to, has that happened to anybody? And it just gets to a point where it's ridiculous? That happens a lot. Deployments are scary and risky. You deploy, there's a fire, there's damage control and firefighting afterward, and it's a terrible experience for everyone involved. It's also, like I said, easy to introduce bugs in a legacy project. And what this makes me want to say is, oh, shallots. But tests can mitigate these challenges. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, tests can serve as a safety net for changes. If you have to change an area of the code, but you're able to put some tests in place beforehand, then you're unlikely than before. You're less likely to introduce regressions in that area than if you had just made the change with no tests. Tests enable refactoring. So if the code is hard to understand in a certain area, you can put some test coverage around that area, do some refactoring, and often what happens is the code is impossible to understand, do some tests, do some refactoring, and then it's like, oh, this is what the code does? It's obvious now that I've refactored it. So that can go a long way. Having test coverage can enable smaller, more frequent deployments. If you have to manually test everything, that takes a long time, and it's costly, and so people don't want to do it as frequently. You can't do it as frequently. so you can't deploy as frequently. But once you get to a certain level of test coverage, your test suite can give you a fair degree of confidence so that you can say, okay, all the tests pass, it's probably safe to deploy, and you can be correct about that if you have enough tests. And again, at the risk of stating the obvious, if you have test coverage, your fixes can be more permanent. You don't have the game of whack-a-mole where you fix something and then you add a feature and you break the thing that you built a couple days earlier. But unfortunately, you can't just say, okay, team, we all agree we need tests. Let's just start writing tests. Why not? Can anybody tell me why you can't just do that?
Might not be testing the right things. There might be no value to what you wrote.
You might not be testing the right things. There might not be any value to writing certain kinds of tests.
You might not understand what the class is supposed to do.
That's a big one. You might not understand what the class is supposed to do.
Well, the boundaries of what you're testing may be poorly defined, so you don't really, it's hard to encapsulate the tests around what you're needing to test.
Okay, the boundaries around what you're testing might be poorly defined, and so it's hard to encapsulate what you're trying to test.
I found that a lot of people who haven't been doing testing, even when they really want to start doing it, just don't know what to do.
Okay, a lot of people, they want to start testing, but they don't know what to do. That's a big one too. Okay, I'm only going to take a few of these, but you there on the corner.
Management will have a cow and put a lot of pressure on you.
I wasn't pointing at you. No, management will have a cow. What did you say?
And they'll put pressure on you to fix everything right now.
Exactly. You don't have time to write tests. Yeah. Okay, I was originally pointing at you. Yeah.
External dependencies. So you could have something like your system depends on another system, and it has a brutal coupling to it. So any change that you make to your system requires testing something to make the system.
Exactly. So to boil that down into just a couple words, dependencies make it difficult to test something. If you want to test thing A, but thing A depends on thing B, then you have to bring thing B into the picture just to test thing A, and it's challenging. Okay, I'm going to take one more. There's one thing that I'm thinking of that nobody has said yet. You there?
There's an investment in bringing the test tools into your project if they're not already there. And if you don't know how to do that, that's hard.
That's exactly what I was going to say, and I'm so glad that I picked you. I didn't remember that this slide was the next one. That was a mistake on my part, and because I made a mistake, I'm going to say, oh, shallots! By the way, do you want to know what the oh, shallots thing means? I'm not going to tell you. It'll forever be a mystery. The obstacles to putting, okay, so we mentioned these two, missing test infrastructure. So like this gentleman said a moment ago, if you have no tests in your application, you can't just make the decision to start today and then start writing tests tomorrow because you don't have the tools in place that are necessary. And you might think, well, just install the tools. Well, what tools? And how exactly are you going to go about writing these tests? The place I worked in 2017 and 2018, we did a lot of things right, but there's one thing that we didn't do great there. We had a Rails backend and an Ember front end. The Rails backend had decent enough test coverage. The Ember front end had no test coverage. Might sound familiar. In most projects I've seen, if the backend has tests, the front end usually has worse tests or no tests. Very common. We recognized this as a problem. Nobody disagreed that we shouldn't have tests on the Ember application. We were all on the same page regarding that. So at some point, somebody decided to be helpful and add some tests to the Ember application. That's good, I guess. Sometime later, a different developer decided to also be helpful and add some tests to the Ember application too. But this developer and this developer didn't really talk to each other, and so now we had two test suites for the Ember application, which had some overlap, but they used different test frameworks, completely different approach. Neither one of these test suites were tied into our Rails test suite, wasn't part of our CI pipeline or anything like that. So now we had this weird situation where we had like two unofficial test suites on our Ember application. And what eventually happened was that they both just died. We ended up deleting at least one. I think we ended up just deleting both of them. So it was a big waste of time and effort. The reason I bring up that story is to kind of illustrate that you can't just say we're going to do it and then start doing it. You have to get together as a team and talk about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. The other obstacle is more of a technical nuts and bolts obstacle. And it's basically just what I said earlier. If you have dependencies, then in order to test any one thing, you have to bring its dependencies into the picture, or you have to mock out the dependencies or something. Any way you slice it, it's not particularly easy. So here is the meat of the talk. These are the three techniques that I'm going to share that can help overcome these obstacles. The first is my advice just to test what's easiest first, rather than testing what's most valuable first. I think this is a little bit counterintuitive. We'll get deeper into that in a minute. There's also the sprout method and sprout class technique, and something called characterization testing. I'll explain all these in more detail. Okay, so let's say you have an application with no tests at all. You want to start adding some tests. You have a checkout page, which is kind of the economic heart of your application. If the checkout page breaks, that's a big problem because you're no longer processing transactions, you're no longer able to make money. That would be really bad. So that would be a really valuable place to add some tests. However, there's a lot going on there probably. That test would be really non-trivial to write. Also, maybe you have a sign-in page. That's kind of a low-value test because people are signing in all day, every day. If the sign-in page breaks, you're probably going to find out anyway, even without an automated test. Not a ton of value to that. However, it's probably easier. You don't have to, it's more trivial to write that kind of test. So even though intuition might say write a test for the more valuable part of the application, I say write a test for what's easiest instead. The reason why is because writing that first test involves a lot more than just writing the test. Like we mentioned earlier, you have to get the team together and decide what tools are we going to use, what testing strategy are we going to use. That's the actual hard part, and this is just like the tip of the iceberg. So if you do that, you might spend a matter of days discussing these things with your team, and then like 20 minutes actually writing the test. But that's fine, because now you have that big, hard conversation out of the way, and you've written this test, and you have a beachhead. Now for your next test, you can write something a little more involved. Then for your next test, you can go after something a little more involved and work your way up until finally you have enough test infrastructure in place to be able to test that checkout page without too much difficulty. Don't worry about what this code is. Just observe that this is one method and it's huge. Has anybody ever tried to write a test for a big method like this? How did that go? Yeah. It's hard because what does this method need in order to do its stuff? It needs some params. What kind of params? I don't know exactly. It's doing some stuff with clients and appointments. I don't have a great feeling about trying to write a test for this. But what if we just took this first line, tried to write a test for this first line? That seems achievable. Unfortunately, that first line is connected to all the other lines, so we have to fix that somehow. What we can do is use the sprout method technique. I learned about this in that book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. It's also discussed in Refactoring by Martin Fowler. We take this piece of code and we make our own new method. So I'm literally just going to copy and paste that one line into its own new method called setAppointment. I can write a test for setAppointment. I'm no longer concerned with any of the rest of the stuff in that original method. After I do that, I can just do it again with the next line. Each one of those individual tests is pretty easy to write. Once I've done that a whole bunch of times, I can take this big, long, yucky method and make it into something that's a little nicer. Or I don't have to go just one line at a time. I could maybe take a chunk. But the idea is to grab off a manageable chunk with few dependencies. Sprout class is the exact same idea, except instead of making a new method, you're making a new class. So in this case, I took that first line, copied and pasted it into this new class. This new class is easy to write tests for because it doesn't have any dependencies. And that's the key thing, is the dependencies. And then significantly, I take the original method and make it use this new class that I created. You might look at code like this and say, well, haven't I actually made it worse? And I would say, yeah. Part of making the code better is often temporarily making it worse and then making it better. But again, refactoring is a lot easier once you have tests, but you have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet, so you might make it worse temporarily. Just be aware of that. Characterization testing. Somebody mentioned earlier that when you're putting tests on a project you're not so familiar with, you might not know what it's supposed to do. So how do you write tests for something when you don't know what it's supposed to do? Here's what I'll do. I'll comment out all the code. And I'll practice something I call reverse TDD. I can't do TDD because the code already exists, but I can simulate TDD by commenting everything out and then bringing it back line by line. Let's say I have no idea what this code does. I'll write a test that says expect appointment.save from params. That's what this method's called. I'm passing in just an empty hash. Expect it to equal ASDF. This is, of course, silly on a certain level, because I know that it's not going to return ASDF. But I don't know what it's going to return, so anything is as good as anything else. So I'll run that, and maybe it doesn't return ASDF. I comment out the first line there. Oh, it returns an instance of an appointment. Okay, that's news to me. But I can change my test now, and the test now matches what actually happens. So this test passes now. And I've learned something. I've learned that if I pass in an empty hash to save from params, it returns an instance of appointment. Okay. And I'll do that over and over again until all my lines are uncommented and I have decent test coverage on anything. And in fact, if I don't uncomment anything until a test covers it, then I'm guaranteed that everything is covered by a test. It's like what they call the golden rule of TDD. Don't write a line of code without having a failing test first. I don't uncomment a line of code without having a failing test first. So it has the same effect. Super useful technique. Okay, so just a recap of the 3 points that I've covered here. Don't test the most valuable thing first if the most valuable thing is hard to test. Test whatever seems easiest first. That'll force your team to have those difficult discussions and make those difficult decisions. If you have a big, long method that's hard to test, use the Sprout method technique or the Sprout class technique. They're both almost the same thing. That can make it a little easier. And if you need to test code that you don't understand, you can use characterization tests to put tests on it. And thank you, that's me. You can go to codewithjason.com to learn more about Rails testing. I have a free Rails testing micro course that you can get there. And if you want to talk about this stuff, if you have questions, I would love to talk with you about Rails testing and legacy projects. I prefer to do it in the hallway, or we can get rip-roaring drunk later and talk about it. Or you can email me at codewithjason. You can email me at jason@codewithjason.com. Thanks. Okay. I've been informed that I have time for questions. Should you email me? If you want to. Is there a test for emailing me? No? Yes. So the question is, some teams will have a rule. Any new code that's written has to have tests. They'll shoot for 100% test coverage on that new code. I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea. Unfortunately, in my experience, it doesn't always work out all that great. Because if there aren't tests currently being written, usually there's an underlying reason for that. Like the skills of writing tests aren't present in the team. And so if that's the reason, then just imposing a rule isn't going to address that root cause. So I wouldn't tell anybody don't have that rule, but I would say don't expect that rule to work by itself. Any other questions? Yes?
No, seriously, what's up with shallots?
Okay. This guy I used to work with many years ago, anytime, he used shallots as an expletive. So anytime something bad would happen, he would say, oh, shallots. I don't know why he did that, but now I'm doing it, and now you don't know why I'm doing it. Yeah. No shallot test. Does anybody have questions about programming, not shallots? Sorry, white shirt first, then blue shirt. That's a very broad question, but I can tell you.
Why do they always break? How's that? Why do they always not break?
Ooh, good question. Good question. So the question's about system tests, and to kind of broaden that a little bit, different people use different words for the same thing. So system test, integration test, feature spec, and RSpec. The tests that actually spin up a browser and click on stuff and fill in fields and stuff like that. And I think the question is, why are those kinds of tests so fragile? And I think the reason is that they're often really tightly coupled to the implementation. So if the UI changes, then those tests will break. If you need to click on a field that has a certain ID and the ID changes, then it'll break. Those kinds of tests also are particularly susceptible to becoming flapping tests. So a flapping test is a test that passes sometimes and fails sometimes in a non-deterministic way. So you might run your test suite 10 times, it passes. On the 11th time, it fails, so you run it again, and then it passes again, and it's a big mystery. Often those are due to race conditions. So you're clicking on something, AJAX request happens, and then you click on something that doesn't appear until after the request completes. Sometimes the click is faster, sometimes the AJAX request is faster, and so it passes or fails kind of randomly. Those are the fragility scenarios I know about. Other times, you run into those breakages and you have to just fix them on a case-by-case basis. That's my experience, and if anybody has a way to make those just rock solid so that they never fail, please tell me, because I don't know. Yeah, there we go. Okay. We'll have to talk about that later. Just a real quick technique that I've used to fix some of these flapping tests is if there's an element on the page that I'm trying to click and it doesn't become visible fast enough, sometimes I will say, expect page to have content, something or other, something that will signal to me that that element is now available, and then I'll click. Sometimes that helps. Okay, blue shirt. Good question. So the question is, risks that are involved in testing the implementation as opposed to the behavior. I think in general, to the extent that it's possible, it's better to test that something works rather than to test how it works. So as long as you keep that in mind, you want to verify the result, not verify the method by which the result comes into being. That's going to be a more reliable test, because if the implementation changes, you don't have to change your test, but you know that the end result is still correct. That is such a great question. So I think what you're saying is, if management says, we don't want you to spend time writing tests, we want you to spend your time doing real work, how do you answer that? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Sometimes you can't. Just to be realistic, sometimes you cannot. If management just has the wrong mindset. So what this is it's a mix-up of short-term versus long-term thinking. So sometimes managers can be educated into coming around to the right way of looking at it. But if somebody says, we have a deadline coming up in a week, so we can't take the time to invest in something that will make us go faster 6 months from now, that's a confusion of short-term versus long-term. And just the reality of it is that some people are so deeply ingrained in thinking that way that you cannot change their mind, and the only answer in that case is to go work somewhere else. And I mean that very seriously. But maybe you have the other case, where it's simply a case of management. They could be educated into seeing the light, but they aren't familiar with it yet. In which case, I think I would explain what I just said, which is it's an investment that we make today that will allow us to go faster in the future. I would appeal to cost. So I would say that it's going to be less costly to develop features in the future if we add tests. I would talk about deployments. If you have a lack of test coverage, there's a good chance that deployments are expensive in the sense that you have to do a lot of manual testing first and a lot of firefighting after. I would appeal to that part of it and say, we can make deployments be a lot less painful and a lot easier. They can just be a non-event if we have tests. Those, I think, are the best bets I can think of. I said one more, and that was one question ago. So let's talk in the hall.
You still have time if you want to take it, or we can.
I'm going to stick to my guns.